The ANC is fighting to take back the city of Johannesburg. Last night it stood with small parties to bring a successful motion of no confidence against the Speaker of the Council, Vasco da Gama. The opposition parties, however, failed to bring the same motion against the DA Mayor, Mpho Phalatse. The ANC has the most seats in the Johannesburg Council, but because they did not get more than 50% of votes in the last elections, they lost the city to a multi-party coalition. The DA was then able to elect their councillors to lead the city through an agreement with parties like ActionSA, the PA, IFP, FF+, and ACDP and others. The EFF voted against the ANC with the DA originally, although they are not a former member of the coalition. But yesterday, these small parties and the EFF turned against the DA speaker. Let's talk about Johannesburg and also what this means for local government politics and the broader political landscape. The ANC, of course, has been declining in elections for nearly 2 decades. But as this example highlights, opposition parties are not always standing together to take advantage of the weakness rather than becoming a viable alternative. In fact, both the DA and recently the EFF have suggested that they would be willing to work with the ANC when a new government, a new national government, is chosen in 2024. To discuss, we're joined by Dr. Kagiso Pooe, who is a public policy specialist from the Wits School of Governance. Doctor, thank you for being with us as always. The DA mayor is still in place, but do you think that the coalition that has been leading Johannesburg is now hanging by a thread?
Good evening and thanks for having me, Francis. I think we spoke, if I'm not mistaken, earlier in the year or after the election, and I did say that, look, from day one it would seem as though this coalition was under threat. And I said that not because there's anything intrinsically wrong with coalitions, but because the composition of South African coalitions is not really based on principle. The first ideal thing was always, how do we get the ANC out? And then how do we jostle for positions? Now, the fact that there was no principles or laid out what I call technical terms of agreement as to what this coalition was going to mean, means that this was always going to be the case. So this should not come as a surprise to anyone.
Let's look at what happened here in detail. The ANC, Dada Morero, he wants to be the mayor, and the ANC wants the city back. The EFF voted against da Gama, and so did the smaller parties. Let's start with the EFF. I mean, last year it was saying that it did have a principle which was against the ANC. Well, that was the posture at least. Now it's voting in favour of the ANC or with the ANC and the smaller parties. It's flip-flopping. Is that about the big picture, with Julius Malema suggesting recently that he could work with the ANC in the national elections in 24?
I think it has more to do with the first point, George, which is the principal reaction of the EFF to how they see South African politics. And I think maybe it's a bit of a lesson for most of the population in terms of when you vote for political parties, what do they stand for? And look, I've always been against, and purposely against the idea that, look, you're voting out the ANC. That's not really a good enough posture to have, because what you should really ask is to say, what is the good for, firstly, the citizens and maybe the citizens of that firm locality. So if that was never really the firm principle in which any coalition was going to be based on, I think this was also bound to go wrong. And maybe it is a bit of a heads up for South African citizens, because I know people are clamoring for this idea of coalitions, but maybe what we should be asking to say, look, let's actually force these political parties to come up with, I know at this moment Salga's working on some form of a legal way of saying, look, let's put this on paper so that people can agree to it. But I think unless the population stands up and says, listen, we are going to note each and every one of these parties that seem to collapse or go into coalitions for their own sakes, but not the population. And if that doesn't change, maybe voters should really look for a wholesale different answer altogether. And maybe that could come in the form of individuals running. But as I said, it's one of those things where we should not have been surprised at the posture of the EFF. We should not be surprised at the posture of the ANC. These parties, again, it's not about the bigger vision of you and I as citizens of either the city of Joburg or Botswana, any other region. It's about them and their political posturing.
Well, that does seem to be the case with the small parties. They're saying they're not given a seat at the table because the DA took most of the positions. And we know some of those smaller party councillors voted against the stance of their own party. So do you agree with Suzanne Boyson? She's been saying recently that the micro parties, the really small parties, are really trying to work against the ANC with ANC tactics. It's all about patronage and getting fighting position. That's how they're playing it.
Yes, I would agree in part to it, but I think maybe the only addendum I'd probably add to that is, look, the nature of coalitions in South Africa. I think sometimes people make coalitions seem like it's a natural order of the day, but that's actually not the case. What really it was, especially if you look at how the South African electoral system works, is none of the citizens in, let's say, the city of Joburg gave any party an outright majority, which is to say they were rejected. Some people chose to stay home, others voted. So I think that being the starting point kind of creates its own problem, which is to say no one is really trusted from these political parties. So in the absence of having a clear winner, people went to a coalition, but none of our legislation really caters for creating coalition the same way that Germany does, where you sit for 3 or 4 months, you actually hammer out a legal document to say, this is what we're moving on. So while I agree with Professor Boyson, I'll always go back to the first principle, which is to say no one really won. And this really just shows you almost the shallowness of political parties as in terms of how they deal with institutions and citizens. You and I are really we're basically voting fodder. We're not really taking care of this. Political parties, small or big in South Africa, seem to really illustrate what I always said, that we don't have an electoral system problem. We don't even have a political party problem. What we have is we have a lack of leadership in this country. And this is really playing itself out where everybody believes they can be the big one who really comes forth and says, I'll take over. But they don't really have the requisite skills to say, listen, how do you really become a leader? You might not necessarily be the mayor, but you could be the person holding this together, but still ensuring that there's service delivery, still ensuring that people almost trust the system of politics. And that for me probably would be my only addendum to what Professor Boyson has said.
However, so you're saying this agreement that's been spoken about could help, but how do you punish the parties who don't follow the agreement? And would that really help? You're talking about principles, about ethics. A legal document may not change a lack of principle. I mean, how do you deal with this? Some people were hoping, saying maybe as coalition governments went along, the politicians would mature and there would be a different way of doing things. Was that a vain hope?
I think some might say the idea that politicians and maturity is a bit of an oxymoron. It doesn't go hand in hand, but I'm not going to touch on that. I'd rather say, when I speak of a document that holds people together, it would be, look, we know that there are egos, we know that people are involved, but what is the real reason that the substantive issues which lead to either a mayor or a speaker being recalled? I think you can put those into a document that says, listen, maybe for a fictitious example, there are 3 reasons why we'll recall a mayor. There's no service delivery. The mayor has failed to hold the coalition together in a principled way, or those things which I term substantive. Now, what we've been told about the reason why the speaker was taken off, that really is like a bit of a fluff issue. It's not really substantive to the point where we would say, wow, this is really wrong. And I think unless you have a document like that, which they're all signed to, and the only reason I say legal is, unfortunately in South Africa, and you're quite right, you can't really hold people to principles and morals. Those don't really seem to exist in our political culture. So unfortunately, the only thing you can go to is a legal route, which is say, if any of the parties who are bringing, let's say, a vote or a motion of no confidence in X individual, either a mayor or let's say a speaker, has not met the threshold of this substantive issue, they need to be called out and taken out of the coalition, and maybe have a special election in the very ward which this individual is calling this out for. And unless in the absence of that, we're simply going to be doing this year in, year out. And my fear is that you can imagine if South Africa is entering into some foreign agreement with either a big private sector company or an energy company, and we have a coalition government, and it just collapses at that stage. You can just imagine the shambolic reaction that could be for the international market and international companies, because they're going to say, oh my word, there is no government that holds firm here. What we have is a government of feelings and emotions, not principles. And how can I invest in a country like South Africa? And I think this really just shows that people are a bit behind. They're not really understanding that there are dangers to a coalition. And again, it's colored by the fact that because we've had such bad governance and policies from the ANC, we really are failing to see that the bigger issue is not the ANC. The bigger issue is to say, how do we get South Africa forward, and how do we get the relevant parties and leadership to step forward? Because in the absence of this, I don't really want to go into 2024 with coalitions, because we're seeing what they really bring in terms of a danger to you and I as citizens.
Is part of this the weakness of the opposition parties who haven't capitalized on what's going on in the ANC? I mean, we have an acting speaker now from COPE, and nobody knows who in COPE could suspend her. So that's up for debate, and we saw that fisticuffs on Wednesday. And there is growing concern that where politics is failing, private players are coming in, health, security, and we may have those big deals, and we have the gangs of Zama-Zamas sort of charging other Zama-Zamas protection fees. Is this a result not only of ANC weakness, but because the other parties are not presenting themselves as a viable alternative?
I'd say that's one of the reasons, and I'll probably want to state your second reason, which I think we shy away from because it's a bit more complicated, because it involves us as citizens being actively involved in what's happening. Now, local government, the beauty of it is you should know who your councillor is, you should know who your council is, and you should have a firm understanding of who you should complain to. But I think maybe South African citizens, and I think we've been quite culpable in this, that we've almost left this a huge vacuum in political parties and also in local government, where we say, look, these people are going to fix it. History has shown us for the last 2 decades, these people have an inability to fix it. So I think until citizens start to say, listen, this is my street, this is my ward, this is my city, this is my province, this is my country, and we actively start saying, let's send the best among ourselves, we're going to be stuck in this situation. And I know it's a bit of a very uncomfortable conversation to have, because we usually like the conversation which says, what is X party going to do against the ANC? As I said, the ANC is not the issue. We've seen the ANC has failed. I think that's a foregone conclusion. We should even be moving away from that discussion. What we should be asking to say, now that we see opposition parties are also a bit like the ANC, what's this third mechanism we're going to use? And I always propose that the third mechanism needs to be, we as people who live in our communities need to start bringing the best and brightest among ourselves forward into these positions. Because if we don't do that, we're simply going to be doing this for the next 10 years, and things are going to get worse. And I think that's where we as citizens need to start to have a maturity about ourselves to say, if not us, who? Because clearly these political parties cannot answer that question.
Yeah, and that is part of the debate around, the push for independent candidates that are really have an ear to the ground and are part of their communities. We're running out of time. My final question is around one of the political parties that you say aren't the be-all and end-all, but the EFF here, starting to say that it'll work with the ANC. Is that a possibility? I mean, there has been speculation for years that Julius Malema may ultimately want to rejoin the ANC or rejoin as leader. And then he's been saying things like, we will use the ANC to destroy itself. I mean, that's extraordinary, saying we'll work with the party and try and hurt it at the same time.
There's I think it's an American euphemism which says, when you know a politician is lying, their mouth is moving. So again, it just goes back to the same fact, we should not be surprised, this was always going to happen, that look, as the EFF, what they've shown to be, one might argue, it's a very entrepreneurial party, which is they find where the opportunity is and they'll invest in that opportunity. It might mean for now that maybe this opportunity lies in the vehicle called the ANC. But what we should really not take our eyes off is to say none of these political parties are thinking of you and I, and history just shows that we need to start thinking of a third vehicle. It might not necessarily be independence, but I believe it has to be a groundswell of community people saying, look, let's take responsibility away from these people, because if we don't, we're simply going to be doing this for the next 10 years, and there's not much of this country that's going to be left after then.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kagiso Pooe, who is a public policy specialist at the Wits School of Governance, talking politics in Johannesburg and the country at large.